Hi everybody, welcome to our next look at Story of a Soul. And I come to you very low tech, and I apologize if it's difficult to hear this video or if it's grainy. There's just a lot going on at school right now, and I thought I would just grab this time while I could and go through some parts of the book with you, because at the end of the day, it's not the video, it's not myself that matters, it's Saint Therese and her words. So we call on the Holy Spirit to anoint us with his divine light, wisdom, and power as we just go through some things you might find helpful as we go through the book. Now, I have given you on your reading schedule different phrases for the chapters from different translations, just to kind of remind us where we are. So for chapter 4 in Story of a Soul, in our edition, it says growing up. Other translations, I believe, call it First Communion and boarding school, just to remind us of what's happening. Now, remember the last time we met, we looked at Therese and what she had gone through with her difficult illness, part physical, part psychological, but very much spiritual. So just want to remind you that her recovery is very gradual in some ways. It's not like she had a quick 100% fix. Sometimes emotional stresses would bring minor relapses to her life, and she will continue to suffer from that Jansenism and that scruples that we talked about last time. So we can kind of see that happening a little bit, which I think leads us into very important ideas about her First Communion. She says she receives the grace to really feel loved. And that is the special thing about Saint Therese, where she is a saint because she's able to receive God's love. And this is in spite of her wounds. I had noticed when I was rereading it in this chapter, she does talk, I'm on page 42, the last paragraph. She puts herself into this category of motherless children because she's talking about how other mothers took care of her. This is beautiful teaching right here about the wounds of our times, not being fathered, not being mothered. That's why Therese can speak so much to us if we have our own wounds in that category, or if we help others who have that wound. And so she's saying, I'm motherless, and she's grateful for that. And I think the grace of her First Communion is to receive that love from someone else besides her biological mother. So I thought that was something for us to consider. Also on that same page, top paragraph, she talks about how in her prayer she thinks about eternity, very much in Therese, this idea that she lives for heaven. Heaven, eternity is going to be a refrain that comes up quite a bit. I also wanted to look at page 46. This is an important theme that comes up where she gets her feelings hurt. She missed a fellow student, thought about her all during break, and then this student doesn't seem to have the same feeling towards her, seems to have forgotten about her. She says, it was the last time I sought affection as fickle as hers. But God had given me such a faithful heart that once I love for always. So I went on praying for her. And then later, it's a fascinating glimpse of self-knowledge where she says if God would have allowed her to find satisfaction in human relationships, she thinks she wouldn't have been able to handle it. She goes on to say that her wings would have been clipped instead of turning to the Lord, who she calls this eternal fire. And later she'll go on to say, hey, I'm not great in the sense of not having committed mortal sin because I'm taking the credit. She says that the Lord prepared in advance for her to not having giving in to sin. She talks about Saint Mary Magdalene, but she basically says, I would have done all those sins had I been given the opportunity. And so she's thanking the Lord that no one gave her this type of love, or she would have made an idol out of it. So it's really interesting. I think a lot of material for our own reflections, our own self-reflection about grasping love or how we treat it. So, and then she'll go on to say that she hears flattering remarks. Other people call her beautiful, this, that, or the other. And she's recognizing that these things can be dangerous. But I really like what she concludes with on page 50. She says that she found that Jesus was her only consolation. This is something we try to tell the students here at Holy Child when we do Eucharistic adoration. But, what does it mean for Jesus to be our only consolation? And she realizes that it's part of growing up too, her childish dreams. And so, it's a privilege to be able to be so close into her own thoughts as she tells us about this. Now, this growing up is moving on into chapter 5, Christmas Grace and After. This is 1886. 1887. This is the famous story of her Christmas conversion. And I think it's important to remember that Therese was overbearing. She says right there in the beginning of chapter 5, she was far too sensitive. And I think this gives us a lot of hope. I know we all have our areas where we're too sensitive, where we can be overbearing. She recognizes this as a young woman, and she's cured of it right then and there on Christmas Eve. It's the famous story where she overhears her dad talking about her, about the treats in the Christmas shoes for St. Nicholas Day. And, all of a sudden she's able to overcome herself. What a wonderful grace that would be for all of us for this year with St. Therese. I'm looking for it for myself too. What are the areas where we need to overcome ourselves? That would be a great point of reflection. You could stop the video right now. That would be a wonderful question to ask the Lord during your next holy hour. Where do I need to overcome myself? And I think if we're looking, the Lord always gives us those invitations. So this is her Christmas grace. And I think it's important. On page 54, she says, Therese had gotten back forever the strength of mind she had lost at 4.5. So this is her childhood trauma, losing her mother. Her mind wasn't quite working properly. She wasn't able to handle things. And now she gets that grace. And this is a great time to think about our own childhood wounds and what graces do we want to get. She even says she hardly ever cried again. And then I think it's beautiful at the bottom of page 54. She has a picture of the crucifixion with our Lord's hands with blood flowing from it. And she feels that no one cares, no one's bothering to catch the blood. She has made up her mind. She says, quote, to stay in spirit at the foot of the cross, to gather up the dew of heavenly life and give it to others. This is her mission in life that we're going to see her develop. But what a beautiful practice. And she'll go on then to tell us the famous story about the hardened criminal Pranzini. She'll call him her spiritual son. She's looking for a sign that he converts at the end of his life. And she gets her little sign and she's overjoyed. So this is a wonderful example for all of us to pray for others, to ask the Lord, what is our particular mission? And often, yes, it can come from just a little prayer card. So look at the prayer cards in your Bible, in your prayer book. You never know what might be awaiting you. Moving to page 61, a lot of scholars talk about this. I think it's interesting, talking about her life and being replanted. She's using, again, that analogy of her life as a flower. She says, she kind of calls it a relic, noticing that when Father had tried to pluck it, the roots had come out too, but quite undamaged, as though destined to start life again in some other and more fertile soil. So we know she's moved from her childhood home to Les Buissonnets, later to Carmel. So she's reflecting on being planted, plucked up, replanted, fertile soil, not damaged, just fascinating imagery of growing, and life as a flower. So I just think there's a lot to bite into right here about her life. And the point is for us to always think of ours and where we have been replanted. Also, you'll notice in this chapter and throughout the whole story of a soul, she loves the language of St. John of the Cross, the nuptial imagery. We want to keep that in mind also. And then we're going to have the famous story where she puts her hair up to impress the local bishop so that she can join Carmel at a young age or a younger age. And there's a famous picture of her with her hair up. So, I think it's a beautiful example of, on the one hand, she's relying on grace, but on the other hand, she's going to use what she has to try and impress the world for the sake of serving the Lord. And of course, the Lord will have the final say. Chapter 6 is the trip to Rome. This is in 1887. And there's a lot on this trip. And really, you could read it over and over again and find new things. She says she grasped her vocation while she was in Italy. And it's interesting, she notices that priests are not all angels and that they need prayers. And that's why I think priests have a particular love for her. She visits St. Catherine of Bologna, St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, meets with all the different saints, goes to the areas of martyrdom. On page 75, we read that she asks for the grace to be a martyr. And she says, in the bottom of my heart, I felt I was heard. When we think about St. Therese and her life, we'll remember she experienced a martyrdom of the heart. That's what Therese is known for. So those are things to think about also. If we've experienced martyrdoms of the heart, she is the saint to go to for that, to help us grasp the significance and not be afraid. A lot of, I guess, maybe antics, we could say, at the catacombs and different things that she experiences with her sister. Realizing the temptation that she could be exposed to, staying in luxurious hotels, being in the world. What kinds of temptations does that present for her? But she is very excited to go, as she closes this chapter, to be the spouse of Jesus, to be a bride. Which leads us to chapter 7, her first years in Carmel. This is 1888 to 1890. She's finally able to go, and we're going to see all the different things that happen to her in religious life. I think it's beautiful how she reflects on what it means to be the spouse of Christ, and she's looking at people in her family who are preparing for marriage and making that comparison, wondering if she's giving her groom the same amount of attention that worldly brides do for their husbands. So it's a beautiful analogy, a beautiful way to think about how the vocations all work together. Now, I think it's interesting, on page 86, she talks a lot about illusions. She says religious life is hard, and I expected it to be so. She says she had no illusions, and that her path at the convent was strewn with far more thorns than roses. And she's, I think one way we might want to put her struggles is to remember that, I like how a scholar put it, maybe a white class worker hanging out with blue collar workers, or, she's a bourgeois hanging out with women in the lower class. And what does that boil down to? She lacks domestic skills. She doesn't know how to move fast. She doesn't know how to clean fast. She's doing her best, but she really can't help it. And she is really bothering the people in her midst. They're very frustrated with her. She seems to be, slow moving and spoiled. And so this is a real martyrdom for her on certain levels. And we see her taking a lot of opportunities to bite her tongue, to not say what she wants to say, to allow herself to be misunderstood. And she's showing us, this is the beginning of her discussion of the little way, how we can do those little things to grow in holiness that many people may not know about at all, but but she is aware. She and the Lord are aware, and it's very hidden, but it's certainly not easy. So she calls herself a little flower. More will be known on the other side of heaven. But realizing her famous quote on page 88, the closer we come to God, the more simple we become. Realizing that she has to grow in simplicity. And it's not as easy as it sounds, but she is holding on to that. Also, very interesting, at the bottom of page 90, she's telling the Lord, I want to suffer something for you, and I offer myself as a ... She says the word victim died. This is something that was told to her about being a victim. Anyway, I'm just bringing up the word victim. She's talking about her conversation she's having with her father, actually. But that word victim, it's going to come up in a different way, maybe a little bit later on, when Therese will talk more about her own way that she's offering her life to the Lord. And we could think about oblation, we could think about victim, but it's going to be there. But when it comes up, for sure, it's going to also be part of her father's journey, which is in that little tale that I just read to you on page 90. And then also something that's brought up about Therese. Have you noticed in her story of a soul, every little thing that she experiences, she accepts it as coming directly from the hands of God, good and bad, whether it's blood, literally, or whether it's snow. So she's talking about the day of her things that are happening in the convent. She's so excited because snow has come. So even when there's a snowfall, she is considering that as just done for her. And some people criticize it, some people like it, some people wonder about it, but no matter how you feel about it, there's no doubt that all through this book, Therese is experiencing every little thing as meant for her. And she doesn't ever want to, let's say, grow up out of that. This is part of her spirituality, where we look at everything that happens coming directly from the hands of God. So I think that's interesting. Later on page 93, she will call her father's suffering 3 years of martyrdom. So again, this isn't martyrdom at the hands of a persecutor, but just things that are happening in life. So she really does teach us a lot about martyrdom of the heart. Later, like I mentioned, talking about becoming a bride, she has some temptations against her vocation, but she knows that she actually is indeed called to make her profession, and she lets us see all those things that are happening. And the chapter ends with her preparation for that. Now, her profession is in chapter 8, Profession and Oblation to Merciful Love. And she's just sharing with us some of her struggles about not being able to stay awake while she's praying. But then she has the confidence of a child. She says parents love to see their children sleeping. It's just a definite grace that she had, that trust, that abandonment, that surrender. And then this is all preparing her for September the 8th, her profession, where she finally does receive all of this peace. And she does talk about her continued sufferings, but she'll say on page 99, at the bottom of my chalice, there was peace, always peace. I think that's a beautiful invitation for you and I to consider our life like a chalice. What is at the bottom of ours? So there's many phrases in this book that can speak to us. On page 100, we have her wedding invitation, so to speak, how she is conceiving of the day that's coming for her, how excited she is, how much love she has to give, but even more importantly, how much love she has to receive, right? She's able to receive. She continues to tell us she was free from illusions. Then we have this beautiful, mysterious dream. Therese always says, I don't have a lot of supernatural experiences or dreams, but she does have a dream when I am on page 103, after the death of Mother Genevieve. She says that she was giving, she had seen her giving gifts to the other sisters, and the gift she gave to Therese was her heart. And she doesn't tell us a lot about that, but it really does make you wonder, how much did she carry that came from her mother in that sense, as her spiritual daughter? There's a lot of mystery there, but a lot to ponder. It's beautiful. She goes on to talk about people dying from the flu. She's sick, she's helping. She says she wondered how she managed to keep going. So even though she has that weakness from being somewhat spoiled, when it matters, she's able to work and to help. And I'm sure that people did notice that. Goes on to talk about how she was able to profit from her sufferings. And again, going back to that theme about the snow, on page 106, she's talking about fiancés and bouquets and flowers that she missed. And when a flower that she missed suddenly shows up, she experiences that as directly coming from her fiancé. And I just think that openness that she has to receive all those beautiful gifts from the Lord, very inspiring, and inspire us to not miss things like that. And even to the point of, I don't know what you think of this, but after her father dies, she wants to know, give me a sign, Lord. Is he in heaven? And then when her sister's able, when Céline is admitted entry, she says, oh, now I know he did go to heaven. And some people don't like this kind of asking for signs. I think it's beautiful, but I also think it's nice to remember in the whole of the Catholic intellectual tradition, if we want to place this book in all of our tradition, I think it's helpful to remember, I think there is a time for signs, and then there's a time when there aren't signs. And so probably the key would be to know what situation we're in. But I think there's definitely times when the Lord wants to answer us that way, and then sometimes he doesn't. But it's nice. I think it's beautiful to know that that does exist. Now on page 110, closing this chapter, just want to let you know, we're going to find out more about this very important act of oblation. She writes an act of oblation on June the 9th, 1895. She talks about the fire of love, what she wants to give to God. What I want to draw our attention to is she says it's the merciful love of God. There is a lot to ponder here. Father Gately, he has a wonderful book about this. It's called 33 Days to Merciful Love. 33 Days to Merciful Love. And he takes Therese's statement and he really breaks it apart and talks about what does it mean to be a victim of merciful love. I won't claim I understand all of it. I think it's an intriguing, beautiful concept, probably one that's for the 20th century, the 21st century, very modern, but she is willing to be a victim of merciful love, and she writes out this oblation. I think it's pretty gutsy to write out an oblation that she is doing. That's what's so interesting about Therese. She seems so weak, so bourgeois, so spoiled, but then she has the guts to write out this oblation, and it reminds us, she loved Joan of Arc. These are very courageous souls. So there is a lot there for this act of oblation. We will look at that in our third podcast, which will be sometime, in the new year, to see what that really entails, to go deeper, because Therese will go more deeply into that oblation of merciful love. We just kind of jumped through some of the main points in these books. I think the main thing is we're taking the time to read it. If you live in New Mexico, we'll be meeting in person on December 7th to go through it in person, and I would love to see you there. Till next time, see you then.